Picture the tent first. It's half buried in snow, pitched on a slope the local Mansi people call Kholat. Translated, that means dead mountain. The name existed long before anyone died there. That part isn't a coincidence anyone invented for effect. It's on the map. The tent is cut open, not unzipped. Cut, slashed from the inside in more than one place, as if whoever was inside needed to get out faster than the door would allow. 9 people were sleeping in that tent on the night of February 1st, 1959. By the time anyone found them, none of them were still breathing. And the official case file, the real one, the one the Soviet government sealed for over 3 decades, doesn't end with an answer. It ends with 3 words: a compelling natural force. In the original Russian. Elemental force. That's it. That's the entire explanation a government gave for the deaths of 9 of its own citizens. You'd want to know what kind of force does that. So did an entire country. For 60 years, that question sat unanswered in a sealed file, feeding rumors, feeding theories, feeding a mystery that outlived almost everyone who first investigated it. It would take a government reinvestigation, and 2 scientists on the other side of the world who had no connection to any of it, to finally get close to an answer. So let's go back to where it started, 3 weeks earlier, when this was still just a ski trip. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He wasn't reckless, he was experienced. This was a grade III route, the hardest classification on the books, and everyone on the team had already logged the lower grade treks required to even attempt it. 10 people set out with him toward Mount Otorten, deep in the northern Urals, in temperatures that would eventually drop past 20 below. Only 9 of them would die. The 10th, a young man named Yuri Yudin, turned back on the second day. He developed sciatica and knee pain too severe to continue, and the group said goodbye to him at a supply hut before skiing on without him. He would spend the rest of his life being the one who almost went. For the other 9, the trip continued for another week without incident. Then, on February 1st, they made a decision that researchers still argue about today. Instead of descending into the treeline for shelter from the wind, they pitched their tent directly on the open slope of Kholat. Why? Nobody knows exactly. Maybe they'd lost the trail in the weather. Maybe they didn't want to lose the elevation they'd already climbed. Whatever the reason, it put them in the open, on a slope, at night, in a storm. They were never seen alive again. When the group missed their scheduled check-in, search parties were sent out. Volunteers, soldiers, and aircraft combed the northern Urals for weeks in brutal winter conditions, searching a wilderness so remote that finding 9 people in it felt closer to finding 9 needles. It took until February 26th to find the tent. It was empty. Their boots, their coats, most of their supplies, still inside. Whatever made them leave, they left in a hurry, in the kind of clothing that gets you killed in minutes at those temperatures. Searchers followed a trail of footprints, bare feet, socked feet, 1 man in a single felt boot, leading roughly a mile downhill toward a tree line. That's not the strange part. Under a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, they found the first 2 bodies. Both men, both in nothing but underwear. Both with burns on their hands next to the remains of a small fire, as if they'd tried and failed to survive the cold. Broken branches high on the cedar suggested one of them had climbed it high enough, investigators guessed, to see back toward the tent or to check for something in the dark. 3 more bodies were found scattered between the tree and the tent, apparently trying to make their way back, as if the immediate danger had passed, and the cold was now the only enemy left. The final 4 weren't found until May, when the snow finally melted enough to expose a ravine further into the forest. And this is where the case stopped looking like a story about hypothermia. 2 of the 4 had crushed chests, the kind of blunt force trauma you'd expect from a car crash, not a mountainside. 1 had a fractured skull. None of them had the external wounds you'd expect to cause that kind of internal damage. No cuts, no bruising consistent with a fall. A forensic examiner would later compare the force involved to being struck by a moving vehicle. One of the women in that ravine was missing her tongue. Investigators tested clothing from several of the bodies and found elevated levels of radioactivity. Witnesses from a separate hiking group, camped over 30 miles away that same night, reported seeing glowing orange spheres drifting across the sky. Can you blame anyone for the next 60 years for refusing to accept elemental force as the answer? The lead investigator on the case, a prosecutor named Lev Ivanov, closed the file in May of 1959 with that vague phrase, and nothing more. Access to the area was restricted for the next 3 years. The full case materials stayed classified until after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in 1990, decades after he'd closed it, Ivanov gave an interview admitting something he'd never been allowed to put in writing, that his team had gathered reports of those glowing orbs, and that he'd been ordered by regional officials to leave them out of the official record. He never said the government killed them. He said he wasn't allowed to fully investigate what he'd found. That's a very different, and in some ways more unsettling, thing to admit. Into that gap, the radiation, the orbs, the crushed chests with no matching wounds, an investigator quietly hinting he'd been silenced, poured every theory you can imagine. Secret weapons testing, a staged operation gone wrong, a struggle with another unknown party. Even in the wilder corners of the internet, something not human at all. Here's the twist almost nobody expects. The radiation had a far more mundane origin. 2 years earlier, in 1957, a nuclear waste tank had exploded at a facility called Mayak, in what's now known as the Kyshtym disaster, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, and one the Soviet government also tried to keep quiet. One of the hikers had lived in a village inside the contaminated zone. Another had helped with the cleanup. Their gear likely carried trace contamination onto the mountain with them, radiation that had nothing to do with what actually killed them. That left the orbs and the injuries unexplained for another 60 years. The families of the 9 never let the case close, not really. A foundation formed in the victims' names, made up largely of relatives, and the students who'd searched the mountain back in 1959, kept pressing for decades for the file to be reopened. Most of them wanted a very different answer than the one they eventually got. Many still reject it today. Then in 2019, Russia's Prosecutor General's office did something the original investigation never did. They reopened the case. Investigators re-examined the terrain, the weather data, the slope angle above where the tent had stood. In 2020, they announced their own official conclusion, an avalanche. Almost nobody who'd studied the case accepted it right away. The slope where the tent stood was measured at under 30 degrees, shallower than avalanches usually need. Rescue teams in 1959 hadn't reported any of the telltale snow debris you'd expect from a slide. And if it really was an avalanche, why did it strike hours after the tent was pitched, instead of right away? That question is what pulled 2 scientists into a case that, until then, had nothing to do with either of them. In January 2021, Johann Gorm, an avalanche researcher at Switzerland's EPFL, and Alexander Puzrin, a geotechnical engineer at ETH Zurich, published a study in the journal Communications Earth and Environment. Using modeling drawn from decades of unrelated research into slope failure, they proposed something nobody investigating the case had considered. A small, delayed slab avalanche, triggered not by the storm, but by the hikers themselves. To pitch the tent on that slope, the group had cut into the snowpack, carving out a flat platform to sleep on, standard practice for any experienced skier. According to Gorm and Puzrin's model, that single cut, combined with hours of wind-driven snow piling up above it, could have destabilized the slope hours later, well after everyone had gone to sleep. Not the kind of avalanche that buries a village, a smaller, quieter one. Enough weight, moving fast enough, to explain crushed ribs and a fractured skull, without leaving the debris field investigators expected, and without needing a single conspiracy to make sense of it. The paper made headlines around the world, and it also drew fierce pushback from people who'd studied the case for years and didn't buy it. So Gorm and Puzrin went back, more than once, dragging drones and cameras up the same slope in the same brutal winter conditions the original group had faced. Follow-up expeditions in the years after the paper's release recorded video of exactly that kind of small slab avalanche occurring naturally, on terrain the researchers said matched their model almost exactly. It still doesn't explain everything. It doesn't fully explain why the group, once they'd escaped the tent, never went back for warm clothes once the immediate danger had passed. It doesn't explain the orange spheres, beyond the likelihood that they were missile tests from a nearby military range, kept out of the official record for reasons that had nothing to do with murder, and everything to do with the government's habit of secrecy. What it does explain is the part that kept this case alive for 60 years. How 9 of the most experienced hikers in the region could die from forces that left almost no physical trace. Maybe that's the real ending. Not aliens, not an execution, just a few seconds of physics on a slope with a name that already meant Dead Mountain, centuries before anyone ever camped there. Yuri Yudin, the one who turned back, lived until 2013. He never got the answer while he was alive. When he died, he asked to be buried alongside the 9 friends he'd left behind on that mountain 54 years earlier, carrying the weight of having survived them for the rest of his life. The tent is still cut open in the case photographs.